Unmuted series with the European Parliament. I'm Calypso Nicolaidis. I'm the co-chair of the EUI-STG Democracy Forum and truly honored to serve here as the face of a consortium, bringing together our EUI, the Friends of Kofi group in the European Parliament, and a group of civil society organizations from all over Europe, wonderful civil society organizations, Europe Calling, Mehr, Demokratie, Pulse of Europe, and Citizens Take Over Europe, many of whom are joining us from Porto, from where Nicolo is also, will field question, Nicolo being my co-chair. Let me just say, first of all, that this is not a one-off. Our ambition in this coalition is to help create conversations that are really trans-European in the months and hopefully years to come under this umbrella, power to the people. Whoa. And this is why we have this translation in all these languages. So I just want to remind you again of the technical points before we continue, the instructions in the chat for the interpretation. Please ask later your questions using Q&A function. And very importantly, please like your favorite questions by others too. So we can try to ask questions which get the most votes, you all know what I mean. And as always, this webinar is being recorded and also live stream on YouTube. So if you ask a question, your name will be read and recorded. So please keep that in mind and leave us comment on how this works for you later on, because we want, again, to repeat it. So let me now just start by saying that with all our hearts and minds in Ukraine right now, we are meeting here to ask whether the EU is fit to fight for peace and what needs to change to ensure that it actually is. We know that while we must always prepare for war when we're at peace, we need to think very hard about the next peace, as this war is still raging on. And let's not forget that sadly, alongside the Ukraine war, there are others all over the world that are taking place. So what we really want to ask is what actions and policies and democratic reforms needs to take place in the EU to become a real, genuine force for peace after this conflict. So, the interest of this topic, perhaps unsurprisingly, is very large. We have more than 1,000 registrations from all over Europe and beyond for this event. And we're very lucky as this happens that there has been a process in the EU which has been actually exploring this question before and way before the Ukraine war started in the last year. This process is called the Conference on the Future of Europe. It's a mouthful, but it's actually a very interesting and exciting process where politicians, national parliamentarians, European parliamentarians are involved with citizens to discuss these issues. And in fact, there has been 800 citizens chosen by lot, randomly chosen, to take part in 4 citizens' assembly that met in Brussels, in Strasbourg, and around Europe to discuss the big issues about the future of Europe. And one of these Citizens' Assembly has discussed the issue of Europe in the world and migration. And this Citizens' Assembly issued a whole list of recommendations, which are now being discussed in this plenary with all the other participants in the Conference on the Future of Europe, the political people. So what we have as a basis for our conversation today is all of the recommendations that they came up with and asking ourselves, well, how does that help for Ukraine today and for the post-war in Ukraine? So to compress very hugely their fascinating debates and what is happening, we've witnessed, yes, the EU has reacted very fast. Everyone is speaking about geopolitical awakening of Europe. But, the response there is not just more defense, more military capacity. Yes, it is, but we are Kantian, we are a peace project, right? And so we know the limitation of military power ever since Vietnam and then Syria and then Afghanistan and So what this panel conclusions shows very well is that Europe and the world, if we want to reimagine how that happens, how the Europeans ask, we have to ask about all sorts of other areas, about energy, sustainability, strategic autonomy in trade and production, how we manage enlargement, refugee policies, all of these issues. And under our mantra, because here we're meeting as power to the people, we really, really need to ask how citizens can be brought in this conversation, center stage, to help set this agenda of global peace. So that's what's at stake with our discussion today, and with what has been happening with these citizens' participation in this conference on the future of Europe and in European politics. And so we're very, very lucky to have with us 6 wonderful speakers who will provide an impulse to our conversation. And I'll introduce them as I give them the floor. But let's just me give you a sense of what is coming. We will first start the conversation with 2 of those randomly selected citizens who were part of the citizens panel on the world and Europe, Dajana and Klaudia. I'll have a short conversation with them because then they have to run to a meeting indeed of this conference on the future of Europe. And after that, we'll have a 4-way conversation with Danuta and Viola, who are both politicians, members of the working group on citizens on Europe in the world in the conference, as well as 2 wonderful civil society activists, Alfiaz and Martin, who have been following this process very closely. So this is our agenda today. So let's start, and let me first turn to our 2 members of the European Citizens Panel on Europe in the World, Dajana Milinkovic, who has been the deputy spokesperson and comes from Croatia, and then Klaudia Deirenne Mazur from Poland. And first I want Dajana and Klaudia to really congratulate you for having produced all these recommendations and defending them in the plenary with great passion. It's not easy, you'll tell us more, but I also note that part of what has been going on is that you've recommended for greater citizens' participation in foreign policy in Europe and the world. Can you explain today to all those listening to us why your panel found it important to stress the role of citizens, and what was this most important message as citizens that you wanted to convey? So let me give you the floor to start with. Dajana and then Klaudia.
I'm afraid, Calypso, they are not here yet. So we need to redo this.
Okay.
Let's continue with part 2.
Excellent. Well, as you all heard, our citizens are busy. Hopefully they will join us in a moment. But in the meanwhile, we are very, very happy to be joined, therefore, by our 2 members of the European Parliament, Danuta Hübner and Viola von Cramon, who, as I was saying, were participating in the plenary on these issues alongside the citizens. And as well as our 2 civil society activists. And I'm just going to give them the floor in turn. First of all, we're going to have 2 rounds of conversation, and we'll see what happens if our citizens ambassadors arrive in the middle. But we will have a first round where we simply want to ask, what is the diagnosis? What is the problem? Is Europe doing its role as a peace project? And so Danuta Hübner, you are an MEP from Poland, a member of the group, the center-right group EPP, very active in this group. And so now that your discussions are happening against the backdrop of the war, can I ask you from Poland, is the EU doing enough to protect Poland, Eastern Europe in general, against Russian aggression, against what is happening now, but also against Russian aggression in the future? Do you see that this current Ukraine war shows the EU in a good light, and what do you think about this role of protecting you guys?
Well, thank you, Calypso, for getting us together. And you know very well that actually the very emergence of European integration has been a major step in defending peace in Europe, because we just grew from the ashes of the war to the fight, and we knew that we cannot have anymore the war in Europe. But the war is happening around the corner today, and it is the aggressor is Russia. The aggressor is a country, European country actually, with whom we have been having relations for decades, understanding on the assumption that if we talk with Russia, if we include Russia in our cooperation networks, then Russia is not an enemy. Then Russia is a difficult but still a friendly partner to cooperate with. And then we see that this was not the right approach, that the history of our relations with Russia did not prevent what happened on 24th of February. And we are just faced with war which is very close to Europe. And the war, which means aggression of a European country, a big European country on 44 million citizens, which is Ukraine, which is an associated member of the European Union, and which is now on its way towards membership. So we are having now a situation that is really just evolving and changing. We are waiting for the end of Europe, which today is just uncertainty. And now Poland is a border country, is a country that was also the first country for all the Ukrainians who were running away from atrocities of Russian soldiers, and they came to Poland, meaning they crossed the European border. And as you know, in Poland, it was this society, the civil society, that took the major responsibility for hosting the Ukrainian refugees. So membership is definitely a step against the danger of war. But then you have to look into capacities of Europe to protect us, as you were asking. And I think we, of course, have this famous Article 42.7, which is a bit like a NATO Article 5, which is obliging the European Union to defend all its member states if they are attacked by an enemy. And we have used it, I think, once in case of France and terrorism. But that's just something which is formality. We are only now actually looking into something we never appreciated enough, which is this hard power, which is the defense infrastructure, defense capability. And I think the war has stimulated, I think, our movement in this direction. But Europe traditionally has been a strong protector of peace through its soft powers, globally through trade, investment agreements with the entire world, with the single market development, which was strengthening European economy, with its capacity to protect democracy, which was giving sort of political credibility. And we know the problems with this today. And also we have been, I think, quite efficient in caring about the rules-based global architecture of our coexistence on this globe. So Europe has been using all the soft power and all the instruments it had to increase its geopolitical strengths based on, first of all, on economy and then on the values and the political credibility. And now increasingly thinking of increasing its capacities to develop security and defense capabilities. And
Danuta, I will want to push you in a minute on what is to be done, what needs to be changed, how these capacities need to change, how to still use maybe the soft power, and indeed enlargement being a very important dimension, as you stressed too. Well, is that not controversial? So all of these have to do with Europe as a peace project. And you are very positive, even though sitting in Poland, you are really on the front line here. But if you don't mind, before coming back to you on the what is to be done, I would like to turn to Alfiaz Vaiya. who is a co-founder of Equinox Initiative for Racial Justice, and he's been very active in that capacity, and has been speaking very strongly on Europe's limitation. So if we're going to ask to start us with maybe contrast with Danuta's viewpoint, Alfiaz, I'd like to hear if you're as positive as Danuta in when we ask, what's the problem? Is there a problem with labeling Europe as a peace project? Do you see Europe as a peace project? And Alfiaz, please tell us where you're speaking from at this moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invite to speak, especially among such a distinguished lineup of speakers and to such a wonderful audience. Really, thank you for the invitation. I think, first of all, let me just say that at this moment in time, we have to really show our solidarity with the people in Ukraine, those in in neighboring countries like Poland and other places that have shown such solidarity with the Ukrainian people who are leaving. And, we should do everything we can to fight this menace that we're seeing in our neighborhood. Where I disagree with the previous speaker, and I've worked in the European Parliament for over 8 years and worked quite closely on EU foreign policy, is our approach and the merits of EU soft power. As a racialized person, having not always been around that, policy-making Brussels bubble, I have a lot more criticisms in terms of how that soft power actually works and looks. What I would say in my first line of thought is that, the threat we're facing today from from Putin and Russia is something that we in racialized communities have been talking about for years. Far-right nationalism, fascism, let's not forget that, Putin's petrodollars were supporting, the likes of Orban, when he was going against rule of law and other things in Hungary and, other far-right political parties in Europe. We're seeing it with Le Pen in France. So, we've been warning about this problem for so long, but yet no one actually took notice of us, complaining about this problem, saying that, there's a big problem in Europe, with fascism, with the support of Putin, in Russia for some governments, for some political parties, the anti-LGBTI laws that we're seeing, pop up in many EU member states, that originated in Russia. So, we've been warning about this problem for a long time. And what I would say is EU policy is rather reactive and is not proactive. Policy is neither consistent or coherent. And I would say EU soft power has been undermined by its own actions and by its own member states for many years. Today we're talking about Ukraine, but, EU member states, have, engaged in their own Western imperialism, and just look what's happening in Yemen. One of our biggest allies, the Saudis, what are they doing in Yemen? And, so when we're talking about EU soft power, it can only work if it's consistent and coherent. And so having, supporting, autocratic governments in other parts of the world doesn't do anything for our soft power. More or less also violations by EU member states of fundamental rights and rule of law. And the previous speaker comes from Poland. We see what's been happening, by Law and Justice and Kaczynski. But, across Europe, we're seeing, not only the far right, but, centrist, center-left, center-right political parties, governments engaging, in violations of fundamental rights. So how can we be a credible actor and a promoter of peace globally when, in our own borders, we are, engaging in the same kind of, engaging in violations of fundamental rights, in targeting particular groups, cracking down on, freedom of media, freedom of expression. And so we're seeing this. And, if you look at EU foreign policy, human rights are regularly traded for economic privileges with third countries. And one of the interesting things, I'm doing a lot of work around just transition and the environmental climate crisis, is this idea that, we're going to swap Russian gas or Russian oil for, Saudi or Qatari oil or gas. How does that make any sense, in our pursuit of human rights and fundamental rights across the world? Like for me, I think we need to have a realistic conversation about consistency and coherence in policy, and what I found interesting as a racialized person, and I'll end here, is that, when we talked about, when at the beginning of the crisis, you saw these reporters and politicians engaging in this horrible racist narrative that, how is it happening to, white Europeans who should be welcoming them? I would just say, but I mean, this is completely consistent with what communities like mine have been seeing, because, if you look at, the way we deal, in the same forest, from Belarus to Poland, Syrians were freezing to death. And let me remind you, they were freezing to death from bombs that Putin was providing in Aleppo. So, what I would say is, where's the consistency in the policy? If we want to be a serious actor for peace, and I'm a committed Europhile, and I really, really am, passionate. I worked in the European Parliament, but we have to be consistent in order to, be a true promoter of peace and a credible actor globally. And, if we want to be serious with third countries about human rights violations, we have to make sure that we're fixing our own problems in our own countries, because then it doesn't seem like we're politicizing human rights. It seems that, we are generally trying to promote human rights across the world and promote democracy, rule of law, and human rights.
And indeed, Alfiaz, in a second round, I want to come back to you exactly on this question, because you're clearly at a different place on the spectrum than Danuta. To our question, is the EU fit to fight for peace? And I just want to respond, first of all, to questions out there that I'm getting, that are we talking about the EU or Europe? Well, we are talking about the EU, but of course the EU is the organization that acts for Europe, although of course the member states too act for Europe. But today we're trying to really ask about the EU, the Union, and what more can it do? Is it fit? Clearly, Alfiaz, your diagnosis as well, if you're addicted, you're not very fit. If you're addicted to oil, whether you get it from Russia or Saudi Arabia, you're not very fit. If you're capable of treating people diametrically opposed who are in a different way, who are knocking at your borders, if they're from Ukraine or if they were from Syria or anywhere else in the world, maybe you're not fit. And it will be interesting to hear what others have to say about this. So you've painted a picture that is very demanding, and we will ask what is to be done. But before that, I would like now to turn to Viola von Cramon. Viola, you are an MEP for the Greens from Germany. And so we know that your group is very active in the European Parliament on foreign policy, and that you've been a member of this working group on Europe in the world. So please give us your diagnosis before we move on to prescriptions. What is your diagnosis on whether Europe is ready and fit to fight for peace?
Yes, thank you, Calypso, and thanks to everyone. Well, if you don't mind, I take the liberty to speak in German while I see that many questions are in German and that the long list of attendees are German, so it might be easier than have this cross-interpretation. Also, ich meine, dass die Idee der Europäischen Union, und das hat ja sowohl Danuta als auch Calypso betont, die Idee ist, einen stabilen Frieden in Europa durch die Europäische Union zu schaffen. Also damit haben wir vielleicht auch schon eine dieser Fragen beantwortet. Ja, die Europäische Union ist nicht Europa, aber die Europäische Union sorgt hoffentlich dafür, dass zum Beispiel Frieden und Stabilität und eben auch andere Werte, die Alfiaz eben zu Recht eingeklagt hat und die nicht unbedingt immer ausreichend berücksichtigt werden, auch rechtlich besser verankert sind. Also das heißt, das, was im Moment in der Ukraine passiert, konnten wir nicht verhindern, weil wir, obwohl es seit Jahrzehnten Dialogangebote gibt, Möglichkeiten also Richtung Russland gab, die Hand auszustrecken, versucht wurde, Russland ökonomisch einzubinden, gerade insbesondere in Deutschland, auch immer gedacht hatten, die Politikerinnen und Politiker, die gedacht haben, wenn es die ökonomischen Verflechtungen gibt, dann sind wir in einer gegenseitigen Abhängigkeit und kein Staats- oder Regierungschefs würde diesen Wahnsinn begehen und sich selbst wirtschaftlich schaden. Aber ich glaube, alle, die sich ein bisschen länger mit Osteuropa beschäftigt haben...
Can I interrupt you in a second, for a second, Viola? Are we okay with the translation? I'm hearing that there might be some issues. Are we okay?
English works.
Max, okay, please. So I'm sorry. Let's start. Let's continue. I'm so sorry about this interruption.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. Please.
I just thought, because I saw the names of the attendees, and they're mainly Germans, and it would be crazy if I speak in English while everyone speaks actually German and understands German.
No, that's perfect. Please go on.
Gut, also mein Punkt ist, dass wir diesen Krieg in dieser Form und in dieser Brutalität, einige haben ihn vorhergesehen und einige haben gewarnt und einige haben auch gesagt, lasst uns quasi strategisch uns darauf einrichten, dass das kommt. Aber viele der Fragen, die jetzt im Chat waren, das heißt, kann man nicht einfach sich hinsetzen und mit Putin einen Dialog suchen und eine Verhandlungslösung finden? Dazu bräuchte man einen Putin, der das will. Dazu bräuchte man einen auf der anderen Seite, der auch bereit wäre, sich hinzusetzen für eine Verhandlungslösung. Und ich glaube, eines ist klar, dass wir die Selbstbestimmung eines souveränen Staates, in dem Fall die Ukraine, nicht in Frage stellen. Wir, gerade insbesondere in Deutschland, die wir mit dem Zweiten Weltkrieg, mit dem Ersten Weltkrieg, so viel Unheil über diesen europäischen Kontinent gebracht haben und insbesondere in den Ländern wie Belarus, wie die Ukraine, wie Polen, wie den baltischen Staaten so viele Millionen Tote verursacht haben, sollten uns wirklich unserer historischen Verantwortung bewusst werden. Und dazu gehört es auch, jetzt an der Seite der Ukraine zu stehen und die Instrumente, die wir haben, das sind unterschiedliche und nicht alle gefallen allen, aber die Instrumente auch wirklich vollständig zu nutzen. Denn das ist das, was die Ukrainerinnen und Ukrainer derzeit von uns erwarten. Das ist jetzt ein bisschen losgelöst von dem, was Calypso gefragt hat. Sie hat gefragt, wie kann die EU dafür sorgen, dass es Frieden gibt? Ich finde, das ist eine sehr abstrakte und eine sehr luxuriöse Frage im Moment, weil wir im Moment einen Krieg haben. Und ich glaube, wir müssen jetzt ganz konkret an diesem Beispiel beantworten, wie Europa in der Lage ist, mit den gegebenen Instrumenten wieder einen Frieden herzustellen. Und wie gesagt, wir waren vor 10 Tagen in der Ukraine, in Kiew. Wir hatten heute wieder Besuch von unseren Kolleginnen und Kollegen aus der ukrainischen Rada, also aus dem Parlament. Und wir sind tagtäglich im Austausch und versuchen natürlich auch das, was die Ukraine für richtig hält und ihren Wünschen wirklich gerecht zu werden. Das heißt natürlich an allererster Stelle, auch wenn das gerade für uns Grüne eine schwierige Debatte ist, sind die Verteidigungskapazitäten der Ukraine zu erhöhen. Zweites ist, wir sprechen über eine reale Perspektive einer Mitgliedschaft für die Ukraine. Nun bin ich auch sehr viel auf dem Balkan unterwegs und ich weiß sehr genau, es gibt keinen sozusagen Fast-Track-Procedure, also ein beschleunigtes Beitrittsverfahren. Ja, das heißt, wir werden jetzt, nachdem wir die ersten Antworten von Präsident Zelensky von der Ukraine bekommen haben, in ein ganz normales Verfahren eintreten. Und ich glaube, es wäre nicht gut, quasi die Ukraine anders zu behandeln als die Länder auf dem Westbalkan und andere Beitrittskandidaten. Das Dritte ist natürlich, wir müssen die Sanktionen ausbauen. Wir haben schon relativ schnell reagiert, für EU-Verhältnisse schnell reagiert und auch vereint reagiert, aber es reicht noch nicht. Es reicht noch nicht, damit diese Sanktionen so spürbar werden, dass sie zu einer politischen Umstimmung oder zu einem politischen Wandel auch in Moskau führen, bei den Personen, die letztendlich das Ruder in der Hand haben. Das Vierte ist, und das läuft relativ gut, ist die humanitäre Versorgung und die Möglichkeiten. Da hat Danuta ja auch schon gesagt, und das wird von einigen kritisiert, aber ich glaube, grundsätzlich ist es extrem wichtig, dass die 5 Millionen Ukrainerinnen und Ukrainer, die das Land verlassen haben, sich darauf verlassen können, dass sie in der EU willkommen sind, dass sie auch Möglichkeiten haben zu arbeiten und dass es eine mehr oder weniger generelle Aufnahmebereitschaft gibt. Das ist klar, das hätte man vorher machen sollen. Wir haben darüber auch viel gesprochen, gerade wir als Grüne haben das immer wieder kritisiert, dass das natürlich jetzt erst passiert und nicht im Falle des Syrienkriegs, im Falle des Irakkriegs etc., Afghanistan, das ist alles richtig, das wird jetzt nachgeholt. Und dann müssen wir uns auch kümmern über den Wiederaufbau in der Ukraine. Und auch da haben, glaube ich, alle EU-Institutionen weitgehend eine einhellige Vorstellung, wie das laufen soll, anhand eines Marshallplans, wie auch immer das dann ausgestaltet ist. Das wird nachhaltig sein, das wird natürlich mit verschiedenen multilateralen Institutionen passieren, etc. pp. Grundsätzlich würde ich einfach nur gerne festhalten wollen, dass mit der Aggression, mit dem imperialistischen Revancheverhalten, das Putin an den Tag legt, mit der Leugnung, dass es eine ukrainische Nation, einen ukrainischen Staat gibt, mit der Ansage, alle Ukrainerinnen und Ukrainer vernichten zu wollen, weil sie sich als Ukrainerinnen bezeichnen, ist es unglaublich schwierig, wirklich mit einer Verhandlungslösung als Vorschlag zu kommen. Und deswegen ist es gut, wenn wir auf das hören, was auch im EU-Parlament mehrheitlich beschlossen wurde in der letzten Resolution und was eben von den Ukrainerinnen und Ukrainern auch wirklich gewünscht wird.
Thank you, Viola. This is a very big list of asks for the EU. And as you stressed, it's fine to promise membership, as Danuta and you stressed, but on the other hand, it doesn't happen overnight. So we're trying to look at all the ways in which the EU might be fit for peace, and to build peace and to fight for peace. And you stressed also the difficulty in receiving humanitarian aid and the problem of double standards. We will need to rebuild Ukraine. We will want to pursue the question of whether this conference on the future of Europe, this process of reform we're seeing now, is accelerating. Is Europe up for this crazy task, a hugely demanding task? And before we go into more detail on how it can do that, I'd like to turn to Martin Speer. You're, of course, a well-known European civil society voice, Martin, and you won a big prize for your action. With Pulse for Europe, you have this project on home parliaments, and you wrote a recent piece that also stressed some of these issues. But I'd like you to perhaps just now react to what the other speakers said in terms of the diagnosis before we move on to what is to be done.
So thank you a lot. Also really great.
In any language that you would like, I think.
Okay. I think I was.
But there might be an issue with German right now.
Yeah, no. I will try doing.
Floor is yours, Martin.
English, and if not, I will switch to German. It's really great to be with you all. And it was very moving and thought-provoking.
Martin, I'm not sure we can hear you.
What you all just said. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So it's really great to be with you all. It was very thought-provoking, what we've all just heard. And I was also very moved by your question, is the EU fit to fight for peace? And as an author and also representing civil society for Pulse of Europe a bit, I was recently looking at this, is the EU really fit to fight for peace question, again, for a news article piece. And looking at the pure facts and numbers, it's honestly very devastating. Because if you look at the capabilities and the possibilities of the European Union to defend itself, you have a lot of analysis and pieces that really show that the EU and the member states aren't basically capable of protecting their citizens or protecting the political unit EU without the help of the US. And I was very moved by a statement of Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who was former Minister of Defense in Germany. And basically she said, and that's now a quote, without America's nuclear and conventional capabilities, Germany and Europe cannot protect themselves. So those are the plain facts. I think the stage we are in right now is this huge transformative shift from realizing we've been a super, I think, strong soft power force in the world, but we aren't really able to also defend our way of living, the rule of law, democracy, freedom, minority rights, also with hard power instruments. And I think that's majorly because we, member states as well as citizens, looked away or avoided this controversial discussion on defense capabilities, who's deciding, who's spying, what kind of strategy we are following. And I think a major block that is ahead of us that has to be overcome is not only the question, is it really realistic that we keep 27 different armies, that we do all those individual buyings of weapons on a national level, and who's having the command of those armies in case of such an emergency, basically, with seeing right in our neighboring region. And another line of thought I was having is the cultural dimension of all of it, because I'm a citizen, and I honestly was part of all those citizens probably that thought that the European model could survive and spread all over the world without us truly standing up for it. So all those uncomfortable questions of how far are we willing, or how far would we go to defend the European way of life, I think I, as many, probably avoided that question. And I also voted following that way of thinking, that this isn't really needed. So yeah, we have a lack of military power, coordination. We're doing too many, or we're answering too many questions on security from a national perspective. And I think on the side of us citizens, we also need a cultural shift from accepting that we have to protect and defend our way of life, also with hard power instruments.
Martin, that's a big agenda. Perhaps we should ask together whether it's always the right thing to say we have a European model, because the rest of the world is listening and wonders whether, just because we have maintained peace on our continent, we haven't always done so in the rest of the world, as Alfiaz was reminding us. Not only in the faraway past of traditional colonialism, but Europe has been involved in all sorts of wars. And it's not always the case that the world thinks they should just use Europe as a model. So, but nevertheless, Europe can be an inspiration. Europe can be a force for trying to think again about how we have a global order that is more peaceful. And indeed, and Martin, I want to turn again to you in a moment, because now we really want to get into the weeds, the concrete proposals, what is really to be done. And of course, Danuta and Viola are part of this group, which is producing proposals. But at the same time, all of us are watching. We want to understand what this process of reform is coming up with very concretely. It seems to me, reading in detail all of these documents that you've proposed, is that a lot rests on this very difficult concept of strategic autonomy, that Europe needs to be more autonomous. Martin was just saying, well, we rely too much on the US, but we also, for nuclear or conventional, but also we rely too much obviously on Russia, but on anyone else in the world for our energy. So there are a number of proposals there that have to do with autonomy, strategic or not, and that have to do with trade in that way. So it would be interesting to hear more from you. And there's some questions that are coming in this direction. How do you do autonomy in this world? Is that the way in which we can better fight for peace if we're more autonomous? So who would like to take the floor? And perhaps Nicolo, before I turn to our four speakers, can I ask you if you want to convey some more questions here?
Sure. Looking at the questions in the list, I mean, they build on what you just raised, Calypso. The most popular question in this list is about actually the relationship with the USA. So that touches on strategic autonomy of the European Union, and indeed Karen in the questions here even suggests that the war in Ukraine may be in some ways a proxy war of the US with Russia. So there's a question about EU relations with the US. And also in the questions, several questions from Christia, from Jenny, from Wolfgang are about the future of Russia. And isn't Russia also Europe? Okay, we said we're talking about the European Union, but there's a question about what is Europe? Some people suggesting Russia's also Europe, that there's not going to be any stability in Europe without dramatic Russian reforms, without a post-Putin Russia. So what should the EU strategy be with regards to Russia and democratic transition potentially in Russia? Those would be the two questions so far.
Thank you, Nicolo. So we have the East and the West and the East of Europe, and are both the autonomy, some autonomy with the US, but still cooperating, how you do that, but also Russia. Russia is not just the enemy. Russia is part of that Europe we're looking to for the future. So who would like to take on these questions? Perhaps, should I turn Alfiaz?
Yeah, I mean, I think my point would come to, what is the solutions here? And I think, we need to have we need to think of, what is the solutions here? And I would be looking at a few different points. I think, the approach has to be authentic and universal. So I saw some comments about European values and stuff. It's about international values. It's about international human rights standards. It's about always going from the international perspective. And I think moving away from this American and European exceptionalism, I spend a lot of time in the US. I've done fellowships there. I've spent a lot of time in Congress and Senate, and, pushing back against this idea of this American European exceptionalism, which often actually in the end creates more problems. I think we should, we helped to build this, multilateral order after World War II. So why are we not actually investing in that and using that as our basic, as our starting point in terms of our policy approach? Let's move away from, European values. Let's talk about, the international instruments and what we've created. And in terms of the US, the Trump administration shows us, the problems with becoming too reliant on America. We didn't have a trusted partner for 4 years. We had a person who was president that, who was actively trying to undermine the EU and, working with enemies of the EU to undermine the EU's own safety and questioning the EU and supporting, the Brexiteers in the UK and stuff. So I think, we have to also see how we can stick to this international framing, but also, focus from a European perspective and, not become too reliant on the US, because the 4 years of the Trump presidency actually undermined the multilateral institutions, the UN and other institutions, significantly, and, actually gives a license to other countries, third countries, to do the same. When they see the country that, was the one directly involved in creating these great institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, that, that country goes away from them. And then I think we also have to understand that we're living in a changing world. It's a demographic change. The world in 2100 will be very different. The youth of the world are in Africa. What is our positioning with countries in Africa? What is our migration policy? And, this idea to keep out Black and brown migrants, how's that going to help us to build allies, with countries that, will eventually become, superpowers. Nigeria, will be a superpower by 2100. How are we thinking about this long-term vision? And what I would say here, one of the solutions is that, EU policymaking is not inclusive. You know, the institutions aren't diverse, neither is the consultation process. And that's not just of ethnic or minorities or other marginalized minorities like LGBTQI people, people with disabilities, but, you know, with people from, you know, different backgrounds, you know, from with our citizens, our constituents that the institutions represent. These institutions, and I worked there, and, you know, they are a little bit aloof. And, you know, the meritocratic system that we have, you know, at the EU level in terms of the civil service and stuff like this is a bit aloof from the reality of the people on the ground. And the Conference on the Future of Europe tries to rectify that. But then, you know, the work we've seen with the Conference on the Future of Europe, you know, it's not inclusive at all. You know, people from marginalized backgrounds aren't, you know, involved in putting together those recommendations. So, you know, that's why you come up with some very weird recommendations or some very dangerous recommendations if you see the panel on migration. So what I would say is that, you know, we need to have a complete shakeup of, you know, the policy making and making it more inclusive. So the constituents, the people that we serve from working in these institutions, whether it's MEPs, civil servants, or whoever else, that, you know, we're actually representing our constituents and we're actually taking on board their concerns. And, you know, that's the only way, and I believe the only way the EU will be a force for peace is if we can convince our own citizens in the belief of in the EU. And to do that, we need to rebuild trust. And the only way we can do that is by actually actively reaching out to them and bringing them on board with, you know, our policymaking. And for me, that means it has to be a complete rejig of the way the institutions operate right now, including the recruitment. I will really end here, but the meritocratic system that we have in place right now leads us to a group of people making decisions or articulating policy visions that is not reflective, but, you know, is also a little bit aloof because, you know, it's these people are based in Brussels, have gone to top universities, and, you know, are trying to influence policy making, but, you know, don't have the real experience or aren't in tune with the citizens. So I think, you know, we really need to look at, you know, who's making the policy making, how are we making it more inclusive, and, you know, really rebuilding trust in the EU, so then we can become a force for good in the world stage, and, you know, we can start to, you know, rebuild trust globally in the multilateral institutions that we created post World War II, and also be ready for the change that's coming. You know, we're talking about Russia today, but by 2100, you know, the world's going to look very different.
I may ask you to conclude. Sorry, Alfiaz, but we have everyone wanting to jump on board and react to what you've said, which is very interesting. And just for those who are listening and who were wondering what Alfiaz was talking about when he said weird recommendations on migration, linking it to the fact that Alfiaz seems to believe that this conference is not inclusive enough. The EU as a whole is not inclusive enough in terms of different diversity of citizens' involvement and the type of citizens. But he stresses the fact that this is also reflected in how this conference is composed, and these recommendations on migration, just so people understand, are more on the kind of the control side, even saying we have to fight against illegal migration, even talking about repatriation, rather than on the kind of the welcoming side that is perhaps more of the sensitivity that Alfiaz is kind of channeling and plugging into here. So it would be very interesting to, but you're making a more general point that, you know, international order, we kind of helped create it. Now, I mean, Danuta and Viola and then Martin, but just simply turning to my Danuta and Viola, because you're in the middle of this process of generating recommendations. And indeed, some of these recommendations are very different from the World Trade Order, free trade, etc. No, we need to make trade conditional. So is that the new order that Alfiaz is talking about? What would you pull out, Danuta, from your recommendations? Do you agree with Alfiaz's point, or do you want to push back and give us your recommendations?
Well, you know, I would like to, first of all, to react to this criticism, because I mean, we all can just list hundreds of, I can myself do it, hundreds of weaknesses of the European Union, and we have been actively as European Parliament. Before that, I was in the Commission. We have been actively always, all the institutions are very actively involved in the process of change, because Europe is all the time around change. But I would say, I wouldn't say just leave aside European values and let's talk about the world, because I think European values are indeed universal values. Give me an example of European value that wouldn't be a universal value. And I think it is extremely important that we remember about the values, because the union is just based on them, and this is the values and how we implement them that is making us credible. And also talking about there's no consultation, that there's no basically democracy, union is not inclusive. I could also give you hundreds of examples of inclusiveness, of consultations that, every legal act or every action by the Commission cannot move forward without the consultation, that we have the whole processes of impact assessment, we have the whole processes of involving the citizens already since, I think, Lisbon Treaty, was also European Citizens Initiative, very badly functioning. We have to change it, but there are a lot of efforts of European conventions, debates for years. So we cannot just say, just dismiss everything that Europe has created so far and say everything is bad. I think I cannot find any other example in the world of a unity of 27 states and 450 million people, or much more if you take association and the European economic area, of people just sticking together, seeing common interests. Of course, there is the question of competences. Union has limited competences. There is the question of very weak internal mechanism towards governments that are basically populist and anti-European, being members of European Union and do things like the Polish or Hungarian governments, and we have very weak mechanism to fight against that. There is this disaster of the Belarusian border, which is to a certain extent due to the fact that member state has to invite Frontex to come and intervene, which is just madness. I think Frontex should intervene as an institution immediately. So there is a lot of things we have to fix, and that is the conference about. And I'm extremely happy that we finally managed to convince some who are still politicians who were very hesitant about the conference, that we need to add to this European Union, which is a democratic construct, but based on the system of representative democracy, that we can strengthen it with the participatory democracy, that we finally have this conference. And you will never be happy with the representativeness of the delegation of the European citizens. But when I was watching citizens, actually, the engagement growing with the conference, and if you read the 178 recommendations just coming from the 4 panels, plus more than 300, I think, from national conventions, plus the organized civil society world, which, by the way, is also part of transparency procedure in European Union, which is also, I think, part of our democracy. I think the conference really delivered much more than I personally expected, even though I am normally optimistic on those things. And I'm extremely happy that we could see among the citizens also understanding that you cannot just, even if we had 10 working groups and 4 panels and different topics, that we cannot look at those issues in a silos way. It's all really, today, everything is linked to everything else. And that's why in this group where I was participating on the Europe in the world, we could clearly see how everything comes together. And we could see that only the way we act on our internal issues can give us this credibility to be effective also externally in the global world. And that was really very important to see. And also I could...
Danuta, you're back to Alfiaz's point about consistency between how Europe is inside, how inclusive, and its credibility vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Understanding that the Global South in particular, doesn't always trust the EU and has been on the fence in Ukraine. So perhaps I'm Danuta. First of all, let me say thank you, Danuta. And I think it's just want to tell all the speakers to speak a bit slower for the interpreters. And maybe I want to ask Martin to react to Danuta's point. And then turn to Viola, and then turn back to you, Danuta, before we close, before you have to go. Martin, I mean, that I was covering a lot of grounds. she did have another point of convergence with Alfiaz. You didn't seem to be very happy, Danuta, with what happened at the Belarus border.
It's a disaster, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's the one area where you're not quite as adamant in defending EU institutions. Here we're talking about Frontex. You don't like what happened at that border.
I am extremely critical about thousands of issues. That's what I was trying to say, that we have to see that we are integrating 27 member states and those 500 million people. But of course, we are in the process of improving Europe, making it better. And we have a lot of things which have to be fixed and changed. And there are many examples that he gave, which I could even add to them many more. And I fully agree with examples he said, but I would just draw different conclusions from this.
Absolutely. And so, Martin, many things to change. So now we turn to you. And what are those things that need to be changed? Very concretely and specifically now.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, before I dive into like 3 concrete ideas, I want to thank Alfiaz and Danuta. And I would say that when asking, can we be a coherent and consistent power of peace, maybe the reality is, no, we can't. So Europe is like the perfection of imperfection. It's constantly changing, and that's how it is. But should this prevent us from moving forward? No. So I think reality in Ukraine shows us is so rough, so fast, that we have to improve on the outside while at the same time improve on the inside. And it's a thing that has to happen at the same time. That makes it so hard to communicate. That makes it so hard to make it happen. So heads up to Danuta and Viola in the parliament and the work you're doing. I think, as a citizens, to say do this, to that is always easy. Then to implement it and to fight it through is quite a tough job these days. But maybe to go back to your initial questions on concrete things we could do. I think Danuta made a really important point when it comes to external borders. The Polish external border is also the external border of Germany or France. So why aren't we handing over step by step the responsibility for EU external borders completely to reformed Frontex, including parliamentarian control?
I note that you, Martin, you say reformed Frontex because Danuta would not want a non-reformed Frontex. These are for everyone on the call. These are the border guards, and others around them who manage sometimes, or rather help supposedly the member states manage the external borders if there are member states with external borders. But that relationship between the national border machinery and the EU Frontex machinery is actually controversial and difficult, as we're hearing. So here is Martin's first proposal, handover, but to a reformed Frontex. So
and also involving the parliament more in controlling Frontex and making sure that, we heard a lot of controversial things about how Frontex is doing what they're doing and how much we know about it. I think secondly is we have to talk more seriously and consider the creation of EU armed forces. I was honestly very surprised when Borrell, so the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, was showing to the world the EU Rapid Reaction Force with 5,000 people, while at the same time saying, it's not about creating a European army. I think that's a mistake. We need this discussion and maybe creating it as a 28th army, so additional to the national armies, and then step by step including them into this European force. And maybe these are the 2 final thoughts, proposal is that a newly created EU Foreign and Security Council that includes members of the Parliament, of the Council, and the Commission could be in charge basically of this armed forces and make it possible that they that this is the place where they get their orders from. And maybe to conclude, because I was talking like in the first statement about the cultural dimension. So also as citizens realizing, okay, we're turning into a second stage of European integration history. It's not only about internal peace, it's also about external peace, that maybe an EU civil service could really help to bring young Europeans together, but also linking them to, you know, what it means to be a European citizen. It's not only about getting rights, but also, you know, giving back to the community. And maybe the Ukraine war is also like a wake-up call, or could be the rebirth of the idea of a European civil service that was proposed many times throughout European integration history, but maybe it's time to bring this back. And I think formats like this and what we're doing here, what Home Parliaments is doing, what Citizens Takeover for Europe is doing, is crucial and will become even more important in the next month when Europe is going through this big period of transition.
Martin, I'm glad I mean, thank you for these proposals, which are very specific and concrete. And I would like to hear Viola's reaction to them and how they chime, Viola, with the recommendations that you've been discussing in the Parliament and in the COFI. Let me just point to perhaps a logic that Martin is suggesting to us, is that here's Martin saying, in this moment of awakening, we need to do more things at the European level, even whether it's managing our borders together, whether it's creating some embryo of a European army more than the small rapid reaction force, whether it's really a civil service. So more together, more and more, but at the same time, this more needs to be anchored in more citizens' understanding and participation and impact. So going down. So as you go up, you go down. That's what kind of you're saying. The Frontex needs to be controlled by the European Parliament, but maybe also citizens. Citizens need to be involved one way or another. So partly what I'd love for us to kind of push here is, as we say, well, Europe should do more of this and that in the world as to fight for peace. What is the role of the citizens there? You can't go up without going down. So Viola, what are your thoughts on these proposals and on this logic that we're moving towards?
Well, thank you so much for the question, and also for the comments and remarks by each and everyone, and also by Martin now. I think that was the whole idea of this conference for the future of Europe. I mean, to have a better taste, a better feeling, a better inspiration on what is going on, not just on the political level, in the different national levels, or as Danuta has said, the civilized, organized civil society, but also on the citizen level. And this exercise of the conference for the future of Europe, I think, was a good test case for bringing together different levels, having like different topics, cluster, involving citizens, involving different target groups, involving national parliaments, but also us as members of the European Parliament. And in the end, and that's what we are heading for, having the final proposals, which are more or less binding, and then being them implemented in the, let's say, executive level. I would say that was, or still is not an easy task for different reasons. Why we had no experience how to steer this process. Why not everyone had the same political will to be a constructive force within this exercise, so to say, and somewhat rather, let's say, obstructive than constructive. And some said, like, I think Emmanuel Macron started the whole process and then let it go, not really participated, not in any way, and probably will take over after he will be re-elected. So the whole thing was a bit, in German, we would say, Verarschung. Yeah? So in one way, I really like the concept. We were really in favor. Daniel Freund, our representative in this executive board, is one of the heaviest lobbyists for this concept of the future of Europe. But in the end, let's say the daily business and the practice, how it was conducted and how it was managed by the EU institution and especially by the Council, is not something you really would like to repeat in terms of efficient use of resources, of your personal resources, but also on I would say, financial resources. So yes, I would say we need a standardized routine on this. I wish we could find an institutionalized way of how we involve more citizens' concerns, also what the example Martin has given. Frontex is a good example where we could have more oversight from citizens, from civil society, from, I don't know, parliaments, of course, in a manner which would benefit each and everyone. And we, in our proposals here from this working group, EU in the World, I think there are concrete proposals which could be easily adapted and which exactly, let's say, have this in and outside view on trade, on environment, on raw material, on resilience, on security, and so on. But the end,
Viola, can you just mention one or two, just so we have a good sense, and especially with your green sensitivity here, you know, if you had to pull out one proposal that you want to really champion and see happen?
Well, I mean, for example, the third proposal is defining standards within and outside the EU in trade and investment relations. I mean, that is what the EU does. But the objective is we propose that the EU strengthen the ethical dimension of its trade and investment relations through. And then we come with 5, I would say, rather progressive proposals in terms of how this should look like. And you really can feel the citizens' approach of, for example, sustainable development, human rights standards, including workers and trade union rights, offering certification of products, abiding by EU legislation, engaged in an EU-wide dialogue process that seeks to inform and educate on environmental and ethical efforts, policy changes in international trade. So this is much more advanced than anything else we had so far on the European level. And I wish we could just take these proposals almost one-to-one and try to get those implemented in a trialogue. But as I said, I mean, that is a lot of work from a lot of people, and many put a lot of, in German, I would say, Herzblut. Yeah, really, I mean, your love and your inspiring thoughts into this. But I'm not so sure whether our beloved, let's say, head of states are so happy with this. And I mean, speaking about Orban and all the other bus heads, I mean, they would just burn it, yeah? So it is, and now I come back to Danuta, when we speak about realpolitik, it is a question of what is egg and what is hen. So we have to create an environment where those proposals find a realistic chance to be implemented. But for this, we need a reconstruction of the decision-making process. And with the council in the lead, nevertheless, it will be extremely difficult to start this process. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, maybe somebody has a better idea, but I'm still, after getting all the information, how this process was being steered or governed by the steering board, I'm not too optimistic. And I know that, sorry, please go ahead.
No, but you're not too optimistic, because in the end, all the roads bring us back to democracy and to the question of, well, you know, you're making rather radical proposals in this context with the citizens, using trade as a bigger leverage. You say the ethical dimension, the environmental dimension. So we use our market to leverage change outside that is important for global peace. There are issues about this. But you're saying you don't think it's going to happen. So we want to. No.
I'm fighting for this. This will need to be happen, because if we speak of any kind of, let's say, energy transition, if we speak of mobility transition. So we need to change things in a paramount amount of, let's say, sectors. And if we think our dependency on raw material, be it oil and gas on Russia, but also other materials, lithium and others, we need to find a sustainable way how to deal with third countries and to prevent this social disparity, exploitation of people. We have to go a different path. And these are realistic, I would say, realistic proposals how to deal with these challenges. But as I said, yeah, this is the problem with some people in the European Union who have too much of a power and too much of a veto opportunity, and who can just block the entire process.
Indeed. So we will want to finish our conversation about the way forward. What are the big strategies, democratic strategy, which is why it's so important and great that so many of you are on this call. And indeed, questions are continue to come on these challenges. So I'd like to turn to Nicolo to field some of the questions that are coming. Danuta, can you stay with us to listen to this last round of question, or do you need to? Yes.
I just have 4 minutes.
Okay. Well, if you want to say one last word before you go, then, or why don't
I would like to say something. Let me say something, because I was very proud of finally of our recommendations in this group on the Europe and the world, because we really found with citizens understanding that we need all those things to happen, and the unanimity problem with unanimity voting, and with ensuring that in the post-war world there will be really around the table that will be where we will define standards, global standards, that the democracies will really prevail, because those standards should be rooted in the European universal values. But what I would like to say are 2 issues, actually. One is that my understanding has been now that when citizens say autonomy, they don't think like some of our colleagues about autarky or inward-looking Europe, but they think about autonomy through cooperation, so resilience through cooperation. And this capacity of Europe to create global alliances, to be part of global a big group of democracies that is together and that cares about the world, that's absolutely fundamental. And to how to keep the second issue, how to keep citizens really involved and engaged in European process, we unfortunately have to fight for certain institutionalization of citizens' participation. You cannot just ad hoc from time to time just convene them, but we have to have a system for this. And there are some ideas. And the last thing, there will be a follow-up. The 9th of May, I hope, we'll also talk about the convention, about the treaty change. We will have a meeting after summer again, so we European institutions will prove to the citizens that they take the recommendations seriously. So I'm hopeful now, more than I was 2 years ago, that this conference, this biggest ever dialogue with citizens, will have a follow-up and will not and led to structured recommendations on which we basically all agree. And now we have to convince those that are still doubting, which is some of the member states.
Danuta, it is heartening to know that some of the institutional people like you and Viola, who are MEPs, have so close to their heart, continued citizens' participation, not just in the current process, but if we have a convention, if we have a treaty change and all of that. So this is great to hear. And now let me turn and thank you very much for being with us. I know you have to leave. Nicolo, give us a gist of the many dozens of questions that are coming in.
Thanks. I'll read out 2 of them, which I think are good summaries of plenty of others. One from Gabriel Muller: how can we build a future in a really safe Europe where all European countries would be included on the basis of equality, democracy, and human rights? After this terrible war, is there still any possibility? And I think the term of human rights here is crucial, something that the European Union used to be proud of and still claims it's representing. And Mihain Bikiri has asked about whether the EU should accelerate the process of integration in the EU for democratic Western Balkan countries that aim for peace. Rather than waiting for conflict to happen, wouldn't it be better to take those countries in now? Prevention is better than fighting. So those are 2 questions.
two broad but important questions, and I'd like to turn perhaps to hear Martin de Groot, who has been working very closely with the citizens ambassadors, if you can give us the gist of what they have said about these issues, including on the citizens dimension. Then I want to turn back to Alfiaz and Martin.
Hey everyone, it's very good to see you. I will leave the two questions that Nicola just asked for the speakers to answer. That's not my role, but perhaps just one thing to mention based on following the working group EU in the world, and also having been in touch with ambassadors in Strasbourg and in between plenary meetings. One thing that struck me also from observing the working group meetings is that the panel EU in the world, that they came up with various recommendations also related to citizen participation and to transparency and to bridging the gap between the people in Brussels and Strasbourg and in the EU institutions and ordinary people living in Europe, basically. And what I also noticed is that they insisted on this being reflected in the work of the working group, whereas some politicians in particular in this working group wanted these recommendations to be forwarded to the other working group, the democracy working group. But for them, the issues related to democracy, related to inclusion, are at the very heart of their thinking about the EU's role in the world, which is, again, very much connected to, in that sense, to what Alfiaz raised with the EU's consistency internally as well as externally. So that's one thing I wanted to share based on my observations and interactions with ambassadors. It's a pity that they could not ultimately join us today. They have their own meetings. They also have a lot of meetings. So I think they have been a bit overwhelmed, especially at this final stage. But I hope that many of you have the chance to interact with them as well. And I'm sure we'll learn more about them in future events. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And indeed, it's good to know that the citizens representatives are extremely busy conveying some of these important and rather transformative ideas. So now I just want to hear back from Alfiaz and your reaction to what you've heard and to the questions conveyed by Nicolo.
Yeah, first of all, I have to apologize. I'm very passionate, so sometimes...
passionate is good. Alfiaz, we're all passionate. Yes.
It sounds like I'm very attacking, but I don't mean to be. I start talking very quickly, so my apologies to the interpreters. Thank you for the great moderation. Just before I come on to the two questions, I would just say that I think the EU needs to better explain what it does and how it works and how it functions. I think citizens just, working in the parliament for 8 years, it was very difficult to describe citizens, what the different institutions do, what powers the MEPs have. And I think we have to do a better job of explaining this to citizens. We've got to move beyond the superficial. I know Danuta talked about European Citizens Initiative and other initiatives, but what has come from the European Citizens Initiative? Not much. So, we need to move away from superficial gestures to our constituents and actually move to, real participatory models. Citizens Assembly, I saw someone write in the Q&A, I think Martin mentioned, having, citizens, involved, in regulating Frontex, along with MEPs and stuff. I would say that, Viola and Danuta are good examples of MEPs that I really think the MEPs are doing a great job. I think where my problem comes with is the civil service, and I don't think the civil service is fit for today. And I think there needs to be a rethink of how that civil service works. Very quickly, just on those two questions, I only have very quick points on them. On human rights, it's difficult because I do believe in the EU's force to be a good actor in the world and, a great soft power. But, there are a lot of human rights violations happening. We talked about Frontex, but, if we want to stick to these universal or European values, Danuta said, then, how do we explain pushbacks, people drowning in the Mediterranean, that's going against the conventions that we created, globally, multilaterally. So, if we want to be an advocate for human rights, we need to get our own house in order. And I think the problem right now is that we're not strong enough against those member states that are violating fundamental rights. Too much backsliding is going on. And this is where the parliament and full credit to Parliament, has been really pushing the Commission and the member states and the Council to take firmer action against those member states that are backsliding. And, you know, we're slowly seeing some movement, but if we really want to be a union of values and a union of equality and a union that, you know, is going to be a strong world player, then we need to get our own house in order. And then just the final thing on accession, I'm a little bit skeptical, you know, we bring in countries now, so, you know, they don't go into the sphere of Russia, or, you know, it's a way of protecting these countries. But, you know, we've had significant accession periods, you know, and we saw that, you know, in the past. And, you know, where are we today with that? With, you know, can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I'm just reacting, Alfiaz, because, of course, even Ukraine, who is now, of course, the candidate that we all champion, will have a very long road. The Western Balkans, but many, however much in solidarity with Ukraine they may be in the Western Balkans, do feel that, well, they've been waiting for a very, very, very long time. They've been waiting for 30 years since the wall fell, and it's still not happened. So there is can we really be said to be a project fit for peace, Europe, if we know in the Western Balkans, you have countries that are much more vulnerable to Russian influence, Chinese influence, because the EU hasn't quite opened the door, maybe for good reasons, but it's a fact. It is a challenge. The Western Balkan, huge challenge. Give you one quick word, Alfiaz, but I see the clock is ticking, so I need to turn to Martin and Viola. One last word.
I think that's the question. I think that is the question we'll have to deal with. That, you know, we don't want countries like Serbia to go into the sphere of Russia. We don't want other countries, you know, to be influenced by China. And, you know, the longer we don't accept these countries or bring them into the EU, the more that happens. But, you know, we need to stick with our rigorous checks and procedures, because we saw with the accession countries in 2004 that look where Poland and Hungary are today. You know, joining the EU doesn't necessarily negate you from, you know, joining, you know, being in the sphere of Russia or of China. Hungary is a great example of this. So, you know, for me, I think, you know, we have to be very, very insistent that, you know, the checks and balances are there, and that, you know, the respect for fundamental rights are there. Otherwise, we're going to have this dangerous backsliding that we're seeing. And it's unfair just to say on Central and Eastern Europe, because it's happening all over the EU. But, you know, we have to make sure that any accession is done, not rushed, but, you know, is done in a way that, you know, ensures that these countries go in one direction, and that is, you know, in a positive direction rather than backsliding, as we see today, in particular with Hungary and Poland. You know, we don't want to repeat that just because we're in a rush to reduce the influence of China and Russia. So I think it's a very difficult question, because I don't think we should be rushing the process. But, you know, how do we keep these countries on board with us or on our side, you know, whilst conducting all of these checks and stuff?
If we want to be fit for peace and use enlargement to do so, it's a balancing act. What we're starting to understand after almost an hour and a half of conversation is that this is indeed always about difficult trade-offs. There is no magic bullet in any of these conversations. Martin.
You know, it was super interesting what you two just were discussing, because I'm also like hesitant while I see the need for rapid expansion. We also have things like the Copenhagen criteria, and they're precious. And this balancing
just
act,
for everybody, Martin, who's listening.
These are the criteria that define whether a country is eligible to join the European Union or not, on different indicators: democracy, rule of law, transparency, etc. And you know what I'm wondering is why there isn't a renaissance of the discussion of the two-speed union. Basically having young member states coming in easier, faster under the security umbrella of the EU, and those young member states like Western Balkan states, like Ukraine, wouldn't have full rights yet. Maybe they would have a different position within the council, however you construct this. But basically building them a path towards full membership already under the umbrella, but being like a young member state. And that at the same time gives the old member states or the established ones, you know, this, they need to stay stable, because if the core gets unstable, then that serves no one. So I'm really wondering why there isn't more discussion about this two-speed option and creating this young membership status, having less rights and possibilities, but still under the security umbrella of the EU.
Martin, it's interesting you use the word young in a very different way that we've used it earlier. Young, a young candidate, a young member. And we've been talking about a Europe with different speeds, different status for a very long time. But perhaps with the Ukraine war and the prospect of bringing in also Moldavia, Georgia, they've also applied in the wake of Ukraine. We need to be much more imaginative in the way in which Europe can integrate countries at different pace, in different ways, and maybe even good old UK, where Alfiaz is speaking from, could be part of that story, part of a new story. That's a very positive thing we could take out of this terrible, terrible war. But of course, some countries might not like to be treated like kids. So we also have the young people who are the citizens of Europe. And I hope we can kind of circle back to this great challenge of changing Europe so that it really is fit for peace. That in part, this challenge means that young people are front and center in that story, including they were in the Conference on the Future of Europe, including in participation, including in campaigns for citizens' initiative in all sorts of ways. We need more young voices and participation in Europe. I have no doubt about this, whether I'm thinking of my students, my kids, all the young people I know. And so Europe should be part of schools, not just to tell young people what they should think, but they should do Europe. They should do democracy in their schools. So Viola, please give us your last word, and then we'll give the very last word to Nicolo on everything you've heard and how you see moving forward, strategy to make all this happen. Big question in a few words.
Well, the connection is becoming very bad here. Maybe that's the European Parliament's problem, or it's on your side, I don't know. But it's pretty much interrupted, which is a good sign to leave while I have the next meeting in 2 minutes. Well, to be honest, I mean, the last question what Martin has touched upon, I'm a little bit critical. I wish we could have, we called it 2 days ago at the European, at the College of Europe at the Balkan Week, the pre and post accession challenges. And what we would need is like a continuity mechanism that this is not, how to say, a sad thing that you are forever in the European Union if you do not comply and if you do not align with the EU acquis. I would rather like to see an option that, I mean, a state, a country such as Hungary is not really worth talking about it. How much resources we spend on thinking of how to get Hungary back on track. I wish what we could do is really to suspend that for a time. I mean, if they decide to go a different path, okay, they're welcome. I mean, why should we spend our resources, our engagement, our staff on giving them money, which is mainly used for staying in power, creating a non-democratic system, which is almost impossible to crack, obviously, even with this, with the last elections and with a quite, I mean, approach which you normally find in autocratic states where the entire opposition gathers behind one candidate and so on. So, I mean, and we spoke on this panel 2 days ago with somebody from the DG Justice who is on this side of what can we do, what kind of justice instruments do we can we develop to get Hungary back on track? And it's of course not just Hungary. I mean, we spoke about Poland. In some cases, it's Slovenia. It's other cases. And I wish this Copenhagen criteria, we need a continuously monitoring oversight mechanism, which would make it possible that for a certain period of time, those countries could be kicked out with all the rights they have. And for example, the Ukrainian friends today said, no, we don't want a two, how do you call it, Martin? A two-speed,
two-speed union.
Two-speed union.
Mm-hmm.
If we want to join, I mean, we really would like to fulfill all the criteria. We want to have a full-fledged membership, and not just an observing standard, or not just the domestic market, and not just this and that. And now, I mean, I have been to Bulgaria. They are not member of the Schengen zone. They are not member of the Eurozone. There's still something what they need to achieve. And nevertheless, they have a huge corruption problem. Even in this case, where they are not, let's say, a full-fledged member in all the EU policies, we cannot make them complying completely to our standards. And so I have no recipe. I'm just sometimes lost when I see the full picture of the European Union, the diversity, which is of course on one hand nice, but it's quite a challenge and is rather frustrating if you want to set this level of equal social standards, environmental standards, anti-corruption standards, rule of law, of course, and so on. And I see in some countries we have quite lost a lot of time while we have not worked on instrument how to deal with the violation of this fundamental rights. And coming back to Martin with the last sentence, that's why I'm very much on the side of a merit-based process and not too much on this geopolitical approach when inviting new members. I know it's hard, it's tough, but when it comes to the Western Balkans, I know they can do it. They are small and there's a lot of political will, but we have to support the right political actors in those countries and not the old corrupt elite. And in most of the cases, we have been supporting the old corrupt elite, and this will not work.
Indeed, Viola, these are strong words. You may not agree completely with Martin, but I very much believe and hope that everyone who's been listening to all of you is a bit less lost. You said you're lost. Well, I think you were loud and clear, and we've heard some very important and provocative proposals, which now Nicolo will take 1 minute to summarize. Well, that's an impossible task, Nicolo, but to say a closing remark, and then I'll say goodbye.
And I will leave. Sorry for this. Thank you.
Viola, thank you very much for being with us. And Nicolo, okay. What have we heard?
We've heard a lot, but I think we've above all heard that if there was any doubt, history is clearly back and history is accelerating. That's the bad news. But the good news, perhaps, is that history is not just something that's happening to us. It's something that citizens are reflecting about, talking with each other about, and even through the Conference on the Future of Europe, with all of its imperfections, citizens have their foot in the door of the institutions which are actually taking the decisions about these things. We heard about the irreducible complexity of all of these problems, the ways different issues overlap with each other, interlink with each other, and how there's no perfect solutions or perfect actors. And so in that kind of situation, surely it's our collective intelligence that we have to rely on to find a path through. But perhaps the big challenge we've got to be aware of is that because history is working very quickly, we also need to be able to take decisive action quickly. And not rest all the time in our hesitations and our deliberations. And I note in this regard that hopefully it's hopeful to observe that in the Conference on the Future of Europe, it's often been the citizens that are pushing for the clearest recommendations, the strongest recommendations, pushing back against the politicians and pushing for the most decisive action. That's what the citizens have been doing, and in particular, the youngest citizens who have been part of the Conference on the Future of Europe. So here's coming to what Calypso said, some faith and power for the youngest citizens who see very clearly, they always have done, they've lived their whole life in a state of urgency and are willing to take often decisive action about it. So collective intelligence is what we have been experiencing today through this call. It's not the first call of this great coalition that's been putting together the Power to the People series, and it certainly won't be the last. We heard that on the 9th of May, the conclusions of this Conference on the Future of Europe will be public. The leaders will start to say what they're going to do about it. And there'll be plenty of space for us to reflect and react, but also to take our responsibility as citizens in this complex world to deliberate together and come to our own strategies, faithful that we've got representatives, people in the civil service, civil society organizations, and others who are going to help us to amplify our voices. So that was my best attempt to summarize Calypso.
Thank you, Nicolo, and for taking time off from the wonderful Porto Festival organized by the Citizens Takeover Europe Coalition back there. And thank you to all of you who are with us still at this late hour, and to all of the organizations that have contributed to this event. And of course, to our speakers who are still here, Martin and Alfiaz. I'd like to simply say that, as Nicolo just said, this is ce n'est qu'un au revoir, as we say in my country. We will be back with Power to the People, a series that is there for all of you and for all of us, the people of Europe. On this, have a good evening.